Hello, thanks for tuning in to my talk. I'm sitting at my desk in Fort Collins, Colorado. My name's Sarah Hinshaw, and I'm a PhD student at Colorado State University studying with Ellen Wall. And today I'll be talking about quantitatively estimating carbon sequestration potential in soil and large wood in the context of river restoration. First, I'd like to thank all of my partners on the project, especially my advisor, Dr. Ellen Wall, and all of my field partners over the past couple of years. We've partnered with some really great organizations and people for this project, and I can't thank them all enough. Carbon cycles between the atmosphere, the biosphere, the geosphere, and the hydrosphere by way of photosynthesis, respiration, decomposition, and combustion. Rivers were traditionally seen as pipes that carry carbon and other nutrients from the land straight to the ocean, but less carbon is output to the ocean from freshwater than is delivered from land to freshwater ecosystems, such as rivers, lakes, and wetlands. Some outgassing from aquatic landscapes does occur, and erosional processes can transfer carbon from the geosphere to aquatic settings, but freshwater ecosystems, especially rivers and floodplains, can potentially sequester large amounts of carbon from the atmosphere into the geosphere by way of long-term storage. There's a large range in estimated magnitudes of carbon stored in freshwater ecosystems, hence the need to better constrain and understand mechanisms of carbon storage in riverine settings. Within a river corridor, which includes the channel and floodplain, carbon is stored in living biomass shown in box A and D as vegetation and aquatic organisms, carbon stored in dead organic material such as large wood in box B, and in floodplain sediments and soils. Large wood and soil, both highlighted in red, can potentially serve as very large reservoirs of carbon in the floodplain. Focusing specifically on soil and large wood, we made conceptual models to better understand drivers of carbon storage in floodplains. We'll start with the conceptual model for soil carbon. Geology and climate govern overall lithologic setting, hydrology, and weathering regime. They provide the template for geomorphic and biotic conditions such as sediment supply and vegetation type. All of these drivers influence secondary characteristics of floodplains, including soil texture, water table, valley geometry, especially valley width and confinement, and soil organic matter. Geomorphic and biotic conditions, and especially valley geometry, determine floodplain sediment residence time, which sets the potential for carbon storage. In addition, soil texture provides large or small particles for carbon to adsorb to. High water tables create reducing conditions that limit microbial decomposition, and soil organic matter such as litter fall from riparian vegetation provide inputs and storage potential for organic carbon. Optimum conditions for carbon storage are stable, wide valleys with wet, fine-grained soils and high magnitudes of organic inputs. Next, we'll go through the conceptual model for large wood. The same drivers, geology and climate, influence geomorphology and biotic conditions, which in this case, for example, might be forest type and density that would control wood supply. Geomorphology and valley geometry create obstacles that serve as trapping mechanisms for wood, where a positive feedback occurs to cause more trapping and accumulation of coarse and fine material. Wood supply and trapping efficiency influence transport versus storage of wood, where stored wood is measured as wood load. Optimal conditions for high wood loads are wide, stable valleys with high trapping efficiency but slow decay. Both of the previous conceptual models describe natural processes contributing to carbon stocks, but human influence on river corridors can affect many, if not all, stages of the model. Humans have historically caused river degradation and diminished natural function of rivers throughout history, especially in the United States after European settlement. River restoration often aims to revitalize those natural processes, and modern effective restoration reconnects the channel and the floodplain. Many benefits of stream restoration are already known, such as providing habitat and increasing resilience and attenuation. Stream restoration also has the potential to improve carbon sequestration on the landscape. We have a good idea of optimal conditions for carbon storage, including wide, wet depositional valleys, but we have yet to establish the timeline and capacity for carbon storage enhancement via stream restoration. My objective is to establish a preliminary strategy for quantifying carbon sequestration potential, and I'm also testing to see if increase in carbon storage is measurable soon after treatment. Our study design is pretty simple. We choose a stream restoration project site, which I referred to as a treatment site. Then we find nearby degraded and reference sites. Degraded sites are analogous to pre-restoration conditions, and reference sites represent a design reference or local target condition with a highly functioning floodplain ecosystem. I measure carbon storage in each category and hypothesize that degraded sites will have the least carbon, reference sites will have the most, and that treatment sites will be intermediate. Conceptually, the difference between carbon content in degraded versus reference sites represents the carbon storage potential of a treatment site. I sampled degraded, treatment, and reference sites in 6 locations across Oregon, 3 locations in Utah, and 3 in Colorado, totaling about 40 floodplains. Unfortunately, there are fewer reference sites than other categories, so some reference sites are used multiple times for comparison to degraded and treatment sites. I'm still waiting on lab results for about half my samples, so for this talk, I will mention 2 case studies from our recent paper, South Fork Mckenzie River and Deep Creek, both in Oregon and both stage 0 style restoration projects. I sample soil with a 30 centimeter long by 3 centimeter wide spoon sampling soil corer, shown in this picture. I sample all 3 categories of degraded, treatment, and reference floodplains. It's important to note which samples are wet versus dry because wet soil has more reducing conditions and can presumably have higher carbon content. I designate wet versus dry soil based on the vegetation, such as sedges and rushes for the wet category and ponderosa or cheatgrass for dry. We take 11 samples per moisture category. This number is based on Setfin and Wall 2017, where they found that bias and variance cease to increase after 11 samples within a geomorphic unit of a floodplain. And this information is in their supplementary materials from the article in Journal of Geophysical Research. The core goes up to 90 centimeters depth, so I can take 3 samples at different depths in one location. This also allows us to examine the relationship between carbon content and depth. For sampling wood, we use a transect approach from Van Wagner 1968. There are 5 transects across a floodplain where we measure the diameter of each piece of wood crossed on the transect. This gives an estimate of wood load and volume per unit area. There are other ways to obtain wood load too, such as timber sale data from a project where wood was placed in the floodplain, from aerial imagery, or using existing monitoring data. We used existing monitoring data from the South Fork Mckenzie River, where I'm conducting a different study involving geomorphic monitoring plots. After riding around in the car all summer collecting soil cores, we shipped the samples to a commercial lab in Kearney, Nebraska. There, an elemental analyzer is used to obtain total carbon content and organic carbon content. We also get grain size with a hydrometer, which helps designate categories of soil texture and also allows us to examine the relationship between grain size and carbon content. High clay content has been positively correlated with carbon content due to the increased surface area of smaller grain sizes for carbon to adsorb to. From there, we convert soil organic carbon content and wood load to carbon stocks using bulk density of the soil and tree density of species present in each location. Then we estimate the proportion of wet versus dry soil across the floodplain. There are a few ways to do this using vegetation that can be seen in the aerial imagery that nape picture in the slide, where flows going from top to bottom in the Deep Creek treatment area. You can use relative elevation of the floodplain surfaces and assume that high surfaces are dry and low are wet, or you can use existing monitoring data like this wetted area map from 5 Mile Bell, which is along the Oregon coast. We validate this using the wet and dry sample locations that we took in the field. Now we'll take a look at our case studies. Deep Creek is representative of an anastomosing grassed wetland setting in a drier climate. Deep Creek is located in Central Oregon in Ochoco National Forest and is a tributary to the North Fork Crooked River. Grazing and artificial levees cause the channel to incise into the floodplain, reducing habitat for native species such as red-band trout. In 2018, the U.S. Forest Service regraded the floodplain, reconnected side channels, and added large wood. Grays Creek is the reference site for Deep Creek, and it's an active beaver meadow complex that's been active for about 20 years. The degraded reach for Deep Creek is on Deep Creek, just upstream of the project site. The South Fork Mckenzie River, also in Oregon, is an example of an anastomosing wet woodland. South Fork Mckenzie is in the Oregon Cascade Mountains in Willamette National Forest. It's a tributary to the Mckenzie River, and the project area extends right down to the confluence with the Mckenzie. Cougar Dam was built farther upstream from the project area in 1963. Since then, the channel incised into the floodplain, concentrating stream power and degrading habitat for Chinook salmon. Also, in 2018, like Deep Creek, the Forest Service regraded the valley bottom using the geomorphic grade line method and added large wood across the entire valley bottom. The reference site for South Fork is Horse Creek, right nearby. It's another tributary to the Mckenzie River and just upstream. The degraded reach used for South Fork Mckenzie River is on the South Fork and just upstream of the project area. For wood load, we found the highest wood loads in the degraded class of Deep Creek and the treatment class of South Fork. I've added pictures so you can see what these conditions might look like. And the yellow circle is a logjam in the degraded reach of Deep Creek. The reference site is a beaver meadow, which didn't have much measurable large wood, but did have some beaver dams. At South Fork, the treatment site had the most wood, and this is because of their project design covering the entire floodplain in large wood. Just a quick note about degraded was that we found some logs in the floodplain that had been cut, so we thought maybe this was an effect of timber harvest or fire management. For soil, we found differences between wet and dry samples within the treatment category at Deep Creek and the reference category at South Fork. At Deep Creek, there's an interaction between moisture and class, so we just looked at dry samples alone for comparison and found that the treatment dry is significantly higher than the other two categories of dry samples. At South Fork, we found that the degraded samples are significantly lower than the other two categories when wet and dry are combined. In conclusion, we found that treatment sites were higher than expected in their carbon stocks, and we're hypothesizing that this could be because treatment sites are often chosen as candidates for restoration because they were historically in a reference condition, and maybe some of that carbon still remains. But in general, this method is only moderately fieldwork intensive, and it's a way to quantify and estimate carbon storage potential in stream restoration sites. The conceptual framework from before supports the use of these regional reference sites. And finally, when you're thinking about estimating the actual potential for a stream restoration site, it would hypothetically be the difference between degraded and reference values of carbon stocks. Thank you for listening to my talk.